Warm welcome to Former West, and specifically to this week-long iteration in Berlin of the project under the title Documents, Constellations, Prospects. And I hope to welcome you here every day of these 7 days, which are organized around 5 currents, 5 main subjects that we believe need to be discussed at this moment in history in the field of contemporary art and intellectual practice. 5 intertwined currents of learning place, an educational performance set up and hosted by Boris Groys. Dissident knowledges, artworks, performances, screenings, lectures, talks, and impromptu statements put together by my colleague Katrin Romberg and myself. And the 3 strands that we'll organize this week, on Monday and Tuesday, a strand on art production hosted by Boris Groys. Wednesday and Thursday, a current on infrastructure, organized and hosted by Iri Drogov. And on Friday and Saturday, we will be focusing on insurgent cosmopolitanism as put together by Ranjit Hoskote. I'm really happy to be able to welcome you, and I would like to just briefly introduce Boris Groys, a philosopher, art critic, and curator, who is a professor of Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. Last year, with curator Chu Zhizhe, he co-curated Reactivation for the 9th Shanghai Biennale, and that same year, he was curator of a project After History, Alexander Kozev as a photographer, which was a lovely collaboration with Boris Groys at BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst, in Utrecht, the Netherlands. And in 2011, he organized Empty Zones for the Russian pavilion at the 54th Venice Biennale. Among his numerous published works are Under Suspicion, a Phenomenology of Media from 2012, then Introduction to Anti-Philosophy from the same year, The Communist Postscript of 2010, and Art Power of 2008. Boris Groys lives and works in New York. Now, in the initial phases of thinking through what we need to address in Former West, Documents, Constellations, Prospects, a project that aims to engage with some, in our opinion, some of the most pressing topics with which we continue to struggle, Boris's recent thoughts on art production immediately came to mind. After all, we must consider what art practice does and how it operates with respect to production if we have any desire to enact the shifts that might follow us to think our field, and the fields to which it extends its influence. How can we think these fields otherwise? As Boris notes, following Marx, it is primarily work that changes society and the world as a whole. So the best way to investigate the transformative power of art in contemporary society is by looking at the specific position of art production in our current societal context. Since modernity, the collapsing division between artistic and non-artistic labor has only become more clear, something Boris in part attributes to the development of post-industrial creative industries that endorse innovative autonomous working processes. He notes that with this collapse, art becomes further representative of society, a consequence of which is that the artist loses her position as outsider amid what we are coming to know as the era of the mass production of art. And yet, what Boris accesses is not the lack of capacity that artists have within a construct in which they neither own nor control the means of production, but rather the way in which, and I quote, every production is at the same time self-production. If a society changes its mode of production, it transforms itself, unquote. Now, thank you, Boris, for pursuing this line of inquiry with such a nuance and skill. And we're all looking forward to your thoughts. I give you Boris Groys.
Okay. Mary, thank you for invitation and for your kind introduction. And so I start. The topic of this session, and accordingly of my introductory lecture, is artistic work. Now, I am of course not an artist, but artistic work, being in some respects quite specific, is nevertheless not fully autonomous. It depends on the more general social, economic, technical, political conditions of production, distribution, and presentation in general, not only art production distribution. During the recent decades, this condition became drastically changed due to the emergence of the internet in the first place. So partially my text is about the internet and its influence on our culture. I am completely aware of the fact that we have in the recent years and decades an overproduction of text on the internet. Still, I had an impression that something additional can be said on this matter. So in the period of modernity, the museum was the institution that defined the dominating regime under which art was functioning. But in our days, the internet offers an alternative possibility of art production and distribution, a possibility that a growing number of artists and also audience embrace. What are the reasons to like the internet, especially for the artists and writers? And now I bring later some reasons to dislike the internet. Obviously, in the first place, one likes the internet because it is not selective, or at least much less selective than the museum, or for that matter, traditional publishing house was. Indeed, the question that always troubled artists in relation to museum was, what are the criteria of choice? Why some artworks come into the museum and other works do not? We know the, so to say, Catholic theories of selection according to which the artworks have to deserve to be chosen by the museum. They should be good, beautiful, inspiring, original, creative, powerful, expressive, historically relevant. One can cite 1,000 similar criteria. However, these theories collapsed historically because nobody could explain why one artwork is more beautiful, original, etc., than the other. So new theories succeeded that were more Protestant, even Calvinist. According to the theories, artworks are chosen because they are chosen. And that actually what we believe in today. Now, this kind of institutional critical approach makes no such sense in the case of the internet. There are, of course, examples of political censorship of the internet practiced by some states, but there is no aesthetic censorship. Everyone can put on the internet any text or visual material of any kind and make them globally accessible. Of course, the artists often complain that the artistic production drowns in the sea of data that circulates through the internet. The internet presents itself as a huge garbage can in which everything disappears, never getting the degree of public attention that one hopes to achieve. But if for an individual the internet is unobservable, is too big to be chased through, in fact, it is observable. So the impression that internet as a whole is unobservable, and this impression defines our emotional relationship to it, we tend to think about it in terms of infinite data flow that transcends the limits of our individual control. This impression is actually false. In fact, the internet is not a place of data flow. It is a machine to stop and reverse the data flow. The unobservability of the internet, as we know that, meanwhile, is a myth. The medium of the internet is electricity, so it's completely a material medium. Supply of electricity is finite. Internet cannot support the infinite data flows. It is based on finite numbers of cables, terminals, computers, mobile phones, and other equipment units. The efficiency of the internet is based precisely on its finiteness and therefore on its observability. The internet creates a field of total visibility, accessibility, and transparency. Of course, individuals and organizations try to escape this total visibility by creating the sophisticated systems of passwords and data protection. Today, the subjectivity became a technical construction. The contemporary subject is defined as an owner of a set of passwords that he or she knows and the other people do not know. It's actually a contemporary definition of subjectivity. It's a set of the passwords. The contemporary subject is primarily a keeper of a secret. The secret is his or her password. In a certain way, it is a very traditional definition of the subject. The subject was always defined as knowing something about oneself that maybe only God knew but other people couldn't know, because they were ontologically prevented from reading one's thoughts. Yeah, so the very traditional from the Greek beginnings of our philosophy and through the Christian tradition, understanding of personality, of the subjectivity, is a secret that cannot be broken. Yeah, it is a secret of what I think but not say, not show. However, today, we have to do not with the ontologically, but rather technically protected secret. The internet is a place at which the subject is originally constituted as a transparent, observable subject, and only afterwards begins to be technically protected to conceal the originally revealed secret. However, every technical protection can be broken. Today, the hermeneutical became a hacker. So who is a hacker? It's somebody who practices hermeneutics by contemporary means. So instead of trying to find a meaning and to understand the sense of the artwork, of the text, the hacker simply breaks your code, breaks your password, and invades it. And that is precisely was what hermeneutics, Western hermeneutic, always dreamt about. The contemporary internet is a place of cyber wars in which the secret of subjectivity is a prize. To know the secret means to put the subject that is constituted by the secret under control. The cyber wars are the wars of subjectivation and desubjectivation. But these wars can take place only because the internet is originally the place of transparency. Now, what does this original transparency mean for the artist? It seems to me that the real problem with the internet is not the internet as a place of distribution, exhibition of art, but the internet as a working place. So under the previous regime, under the modern regime, under the regime that was defined by the museum, there were very clear difference, very clear cut line between production and showing of the works. So the artist produced his or her works in the atelier, and they brought these works to the public, to the museum or gallery, to the exhibition. And that was a central difference between the so-called creative process or creative work and non-creative, alienated work. Industrial workers operated under the gaze of the others, under the permanent control by the others that was so eloquently described by Michel Foucault. The writers or artists worked in seclusion, beyond the panoptic public control. However, if the so-called creative worker uses the internet, he or she is subjected to the same or even greater degree of surveillance as the Foucauldian worker. The only difference is that the surveillance is more hermeneutic, as I said already, than disciplinary one. The results of surveillance are sold by the corporations that control the internet because they own the means of production, the material technical basis of the internet. So we have, in a very strange way, the hermeneutics back. The classical hermeneutics has searched for the author behind the work, and for that it was criticized by the theoretician of structuralism, close reading, etc., who saw that it makes no sense to chase ontological secrets that are anyway inaccessible by definition. Today, this old traditional hermeneutics is reborn as a means of additional economic exploitation of the subject operating in the internet, in which all the secrets are originally revealed. The subject is here not concealed anymore behind his or her work. The surplus value that such a subject produces and that is appropriated by the internet corporations is the hermeneutic value. The subject not only does something in the internet, but also reveals himself or herself as a human being with certain interests, desires, and needs. And this information has certain value, also monetary value. The monetarization of classical hermeneutics is one of the most interesting processes that one is confronted in the course of the last decades. Yeah? So we have this a simple way to follow the author at the moment of creation, at the moment of the work. That was impossible under the, so to say, ancien regime. Now, at the first glance, it seems that for the artists, this permanent exposure has more positive than negative sides. The synchronization of art production and art exposure through the internet seems to make things better, not worse. Indeed, this resynchronization means that the artist one does not need to produce any final product, any artwork. Here, the documentation of the process of art making is already an artwork. Art production, presentation, and distribution coincide. The artist becomes a blogger. Almost everyone in the contemporary art world acts as a blogger, voluntary or involuntary. Individual artists, but also the art institutions, and actually also museums. So if you want to know something about art, you begin to follow art. The museum, for example, earlier was a place of contemplation. So nothing happened there. You came into the museum just to look at something that was already there and will be there after you left. But now, the museum became a place of hectic activity. Yeah? You know, lectures, screenings, events, yeah, performances, temporary exhibitions. Something happens, and something happens all the time, even faster, outside of the museum. So you cannot see anything there, but you can follow the activities. Yeah? What now we're doing, we follow the activities of the museum, of the individual artist, and art world in general. This follow the activities instead of looking at is precisely the new regime of our reaction to what art and artwork are. In this sense, Ai Weiwei is paradigmatic, yeah, because he is basically a blogger. Balzac's artist, who never could present his masterpiece. You remember this novel by Balzac about this unhappy artist who died also completely frustrated because he never could create a masterpiece. Today, he would be a blogger. And documentation of his vain efforts to create a masterpiece would be already his masterpiece. So that would be followed by everybody and admired. Admired precisely because it didn't lead to any particular result. So the emergence, yeah. So as Nietzsche wrote this famous "God is dead," he continued, "We have lost the spectator." He has almost never quoted him. part that what he wrote. The emergence of the internet means the return of the universal spectator. So it seems that we are back in the paradise and like saints do the immaterial work of pure existence under the divine gaze. In fact, the life of saints can be described as a blog that is read by God and remains uninterrupted even by the saint's death. Yeah? What do actually the saints? What is the difference between the saint and ordinary people? The saints only live. They only exist, and the only information, they are singing all the time, yeah? The only information they give about themselves is that further exist. And that is what God actually reacts to, and that's why they are saints. And that's why they are immaterial. So why do we need any secret anymore? Why would we reject the radical transparency? The answer to these questions depends on the answer to a more fundamental question concerning the internet. Does the internet effectuate the return of God, and so return of the church, or Malin-Génie with its evil eye? Already Jean-Paul Sartre said that the hell are the others, the life under the gaze of the others is a definition of hell. And Jacques Lacan said later that the eye of the other is always an evil eye. So the internet is paradise and hell at the same time. Sartre defines the human subjectivity as a project directed towards the future. And this project as ontologically guaranteed secret, because it can never be revealed here and now, but only in the future. In other words, Sartre understood the human subjects as struggling against the identity that was given to them by society. That explains why he interpreted the gaze of the other as the hell. In the gaze of the other, we see that we lost the battle and remain prisoners of our socially codified identity. That's why the artist, the modern artist, tried to avoid the gaze of the other during the working process in the atelier, to be able to reveal the true self, and after a certain period of seclusion, to reappear in the public in a new shape, in a new form. This state of temporary absence is constituted for what we call the creative process. In fact, it is precisely what we call the creative process. Creative process is simply this act of absence. André Breton tells a story about a French poet who, when he went to sleep, put on his door the announcement, "Please be quiet, the poet is working." So he was working because he was absent. This anecdote summarizes the traditional understanding of creative work. Creative work is creative because it takes place beyond the public control. The time of absence could last days, months, years, even the whole life. Only at the end of this period of absence, the author is expected to present a work. This work may be also found in his papers posthumously. That's the best case. That would be then accepted as creative genie precisely because it seemed to emerge quasi out of nothingness. In other words, the creative work is a work that presupposes desynchronization of the time of work with the time of exposure and results of the work. So the work in the seclusion and secrecy. Now, the artistic practice is often understood as being individual, personal one. But what does the individual and personal mean? The individual is often understood as being different from the others. So they say very often, they criticize a totalitarian society because they assume that in totalitarian society, all are alike. In a democratic, pluralistic society, all are different, and these differences are respected. So this kind of discourse presupposes the equality, indifference, or difference inequality of ordinary, really existing persons. Persons are given in our social experience. However, here the point is not so much one's difference from the others, but one's difference from oneself. The refusal to be identified according to the general criteria of identification. Indeed, the parameters that define our socially codified nominal identity are completely foreign to us. We have not chosen our names. We have not been consciously present at the date and place of our birth. We have not given the name of the city and street where we are supposed to live. We have not chosen our parents, our nationality, and so on and so on. So all these external parameters of our existence have no meaning for us. They do not correlate to any subjective evidence. They indicate how the others see us, but they are completely irrelevant for our subjective life. The modern artist practiced a revolt against the identities, against the social codified nominal identities, which were imposed on them by the others, by society, state, school, parents, police, and so on. In the name of the self-identification that the artist undertook in the sovereign way. The modern art was a search for the true self. Here the question is not if the true self is real or merely a metaphysical fiction. Of course, it is a metaphysical fiction. The question of identity is not a question of truth, but a question of power. Who has the power over my own identity, I or society, and more general, who has the control, the sovereignty over the social taxonomy, social mechanism of identification in general, the state institution or subjectivities. That means that the struggle against my own public persona and nominal identity in the name of my sovereign persona or sovereign identity is also a public political dimension because it is directed against the dominating mechanisms of identification, the dominating social taxonomy with all its divisions and hierarchies. That is why the modern artist always said, do not look at me, look at what I'm doing. Of course, the strategy, later the artists mostly gave up the search for the hidden true self. They began to use the nominal identity as ready-mades and to organize a complicated play with them, plays of affirmation, deconstruction, and so on. But the strategy still presupposes a disidentification from the nominal socially codified identities to become able to artistically reappropriate, transform, and manipulate them. So the modernity was a time of desire for utopia, and the utopia is precisely the place at which my true identity, whatever it could be, is accepted and respected by the society, not my socially given identity, but what I see as my own subjective project. My own subjective project is accepted and valued. Here the individual project of seeking for the true self acquires a political dimension. The artistic project became here a revolutionary project that aimed at the total transformation of the whole society and obliteration of all the existing taxonomies and hierarchies. Of course, this kind of revolutionary project also needed self-isolation, secrecy, and seclusion. Here the true self is utopia resocialized in a utopian way through the creation of the true society. Meanwhile, the revolutionary projects became historicized in their turn. We can see it today as a former communist mankind becomes renationalized and reinscribed in Russian, Chinese, and other national histories. So if we speak about former East, and that is a kind of presupposition and indication and ground for the selection of this title, former West, when we speak about former East, then we have to realize that we are now much, much former than the former East. So our way is not for the former East further, but for the former East backwards, back to the national identity, back to a reinscription of the utopian projects into the cultural context of the time, back to the 19th century, in fact, so back to the period before these social, revolutionary, creative processes actually started. And in this sense, the former West is also indeed much more formal than it was before. As I immigrated from the USSR, it was 1980, yeah, it was Brezhnev time still. As I migrated to the West, I emigrated to the West, something that the West existed at that time. You could really go to the West. Yeah? Now it is impossible. You cannot emigrate to the West because the West doesn't exist. Yeah? You have Germany, you have Cyprus, you have Spain, you have Italy, you have the USA. The unity, ideological, political, economical unity of the West dissolves, and it dissolves very fast. It dissolves very fast politically, it dissolves very fast economically, and it dissolves culture even faster. So something like a West, yeah, as it was formed by the history of the 20th century, doesn't exist anymore. We are back in the 19th century in the East, and we are back in the 19th century in the West with nationalism, political liberalism, open markets, terrorism, local wars, colonial expeditions, and all that. What we have now. Also, actually, celebrity culture. Yeah, celebrity culture started in the middle of the 19th century. So everything is back. And not only it is back as a reaction to so-called collapse of the modern utopian projects, but as I will try to show now, also as an effect of collapse of what I could call post-modern utopian projects. In the times of the so-called postmodernity, the search for the true self, and accordingly the true society, in which this true self could be revealed, was proclaimed to be obsolete. Therefore, we tend to speak about the postmodernity as post-utopian time, but it's not quite true. The postmodernity did not give up the struggle against the subject nominal identity. In fact, it has even radicalized the struggle. Postmodernity had its own utopia, and it is utopia of self-dissolution of the subject in the infinite anonymous flows of energy, desire, or play of signifiers. So instead of nominal self, you don't get a true self. Simply, the nominal self dissolves, and you begin to be a vehicle for kind of anonymous powers, on anonymous forces of desire. Yeah, I think Deleuze is a very good example of that. Instead of abolishing the nominal social self, you have this kind of ecstasy of infinite flows of energy. The postmodern utopian euphoria that the notion of reproduction provoked at that time, so reproduction instead of production, can be well illustrated by a following passage from the book on the museum's ruins, 1993, by Douglas Crimp. In this rather well-known book, Crimp claimed it with reference to Walter Benjamin, and I quote, "Through reproductive technology, postmodernist art dispenses with the aura. The fiction of creating subject gives way to the frank confiscation, quotation, expropriation, accumulation, and repetition of already existing images. Notions of originality, authenticity, and presence, essential to the ordered discourse of the museum, are undermined." End of quotation. So the flow of reproduction overflows the museum, and the individual identity drowns in its flow. The internet became, from some time, a place on which these postmodern utopian dreams were projected. I actually remember very well this time. I also participated in a lot of conferences where the communist mankind was substituted by reason. Yeah? However, the internet has become not a place of realization, but a graveyard for the postmodern utopias, as a museum became a graveyard for the modern utopias. Indeed, the most important aspect of the internet is that it fundamentally changes the notion of the flow. The flow, as I already said, begin to be turned against itself. Walter Benjamin famously distinguished between the original that is defined through its here and now, and the copy that is sightless, topologically indeterminate, lacking here and now. Now, that is this aura, a reference by Krimp. Now, the contemporary digital reproduction is by no means sightless. Its circulation is not topologically undetermined, and it does not present itself in the form of multiplicity, as Benjamin described it. In the internet, every data file has its address, and accordingly its place. The same data file with a different address is a different data file. Here, the aura of originality does not get lost. The here and now never gets lost. Rather becomes substituted by a different aura. In the internet, the circulation of the digital data produces not the copies, but new originals. And this circulation is perfectly traceable. The individual data never gets deteriorated, so the internet is actually a place where all these flows, allegedly infinite flows that were sematized by postmodern thought, gets actually re-territorialized. So we make the digital files appear by clicking of their names, and by doing so, we immediately make our gesture traceable. So place and time, here and now, are reestablished and easily traceable. So the only way to keep the subjectivity intact under these conditions is to define it as unbreakable conspiracy. And I would like to quote a good example of that. So WikiLeaks is very well known as a place, as an agency for free flow of data. But actually, organization of this free flow is based on a certain kind of conspiracy. In one of his interviews, Julian Assange says, I quote, "So if you and I agree on particular encryption code, and it is mathematically strong, then the forces of every superpower brought to bear on that code still cannot crack it. So a state can desire to do something to an individual, yet it is simply not possible for the state to do it, and in this sense, mathematics and individuals are stronger than superpowers." End of quotation. So absolute subjectivity began to be unbreakable encryption. And unbreakable encryption is what actually Plato and Descartes and many other thinkers of Western philosophical tradition actually dreamt of. But here, the unbreakable encryption is the synonym of true subjectivity. It's our true utopia. Our true utopia is to find unbreakable encryption. Now, I think I am a bit running out of my time, So what I would like to do is to close this presentation that looked somewhat a bit pessimistic here. So museum didn't work, and the internet didn't work, and nothing didn't work. So I would like to say something nice at the end. Nice but ambiguous, yeah? Ambiguous nice. So if rereading my own text, I see that I connected utopian or maybe heterotopian impulse and desire with the archive, be it in the museum, be it in the internet. So indeed, the archive is central for the development of utopian consciousness and utopian desire in 19th century and 20th century. Because the archive is, of course, not primarily a place to collect and present the past to the contemporary audience. That is how the archive is very often understood, and how it is really working, yeah, in many ways, but it's not its essential definition. Its essential definition is a utopian promise that archive gives to contemporary subject to escape contemporaneity. The archive is a place on which we can project our projects as a possible bearer of this project toward the future. So there is some chance, it offers and suggests some chance for our project to be realized and to be socially, politically, economically carried on toward the future. And this kind of promise is essential. Now, in what way I would see that as essential? There is a lot of discussion about the question, what is the relationship between art and politics, and to what degree art is capable to change the world. Yeah, okay. This kind of discourse is understandable, and it is legitimized by the fact that art and politics, in many ways, and in many respects, operate both in the same space, that is a public space. So they occupy basically the same space. And occupying the same contemporary space, they also can collaborate, they can come into conflict, they can split along different lines, and so on and so on, so that they are intimately interconnected. But there is one aspect in art that politics to this degree and in this sense doesn't have, and that is the archive. The archive, not of the historical events. Yeah? The archive of the historical events tells us about the political past. Yeah? And so the politics enters the archive in this way. No. It is an archive of individual subjective attempts to escape the historical here and now, and to project oneself into the future. So there's a different kind of archive. Yeah. This different kind of archive is always a material one. It is not a kind of illusion. The problem with Sartre a bit is that he subjectifies everything. Yeah? He thinks about everything as a play of imagination. But in fact, art and this kind of archive, they are material. So we have documentations, we have artworks, we have also internet sites, we have blogs, and so on and so on. We have them as material facts. And by forming the archive and forming the material, practical, technical side of our world and our future world, art can influence our world in much deeper and much more radical ways than politics. The effect of art is always a bit postponed. So if politics operates today and really must be efficient here and now indeed, because politics has no other time at its disposal, art has its time. It has its time and can postpone its action, and actually has to postpone its action, by creating something material, some objects and facts with which next generation have to live with, and to which they have to accommodate to. So what art is a kind of techne. Art is operating not only on political, but also technical level. And in this sense, I think we have to go back to Marx here and to remind ourselves that it's actually material basis that defines the society. Society is actually including policy as a superstructure. So the art works in a longer way, in a postponed way. It is directed toward the future, but it is directed toward the material basis of the future society. It modifies this material basis, and this way it brings the further generation to accommodate or to take in consideration what the present generation maybe does not take in consideration. It is a postponed effect, but it is a very powerful effect because it acts on the level of material basis and not on the level of opinions, ideologies, and political decisions. In this sense, the archive, in its sheer materiality, is a carrier of a different kind of promise. It is not a promise of different ideology or sensibility or politics. It is a promise of a different context of our existence, including our everyday existence. And I think it is problematic, but at the same time, very radical promise. So, okay, I'm in time. Thank you. Yeah, we can take some questions here because I began a bit late, so 10 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Boris. We just agreed that we can use this opportunity to pose a question or two. Boris is going to host this whole 2 days. And as we are going to relocate the following a contribution by Hito Steyr from theater to this room, I would like to encourage you to stay for next question or two, and then we will follow with the program of Hito Steyr. There are 2 microphones on the side, and there is already one question. Please take a mic.
I think this is working, yes. I do not have so much a question, but more an attempt of problematizing this idea of the unbreakability of the internet. And I would like to take your Marxist hint of exploring the material basis of a superstructure and to explore the material basis of the internet. I'm here referring to protocol. I'm taking this from the works of Alexander Galloway, exploring protocol. And by protocol, I mean the standards governing the implementation of specific technologies. So, in a way, the index of this archive that you speak of. Protocol is, protocol is a series of ways of organizing code, like, for example, IP address, internet protocol, and also DNS, domain system. These are all modes in which the internet is not so much a free flow of information, but actually a very centralized power structure of information. And in that case, perhaps the hacker could be an interesting category, not as an hermeneutic category, because hermeneutics always relates to reading, but a hacker is actually a writer or eraser of code. A hacker can destroy your password, not actually gain access to it. So in that case, perhaps also the artist could be seen not only as a producer of objects, of images, of materials, which would then be translated into code, managed by different protocols, de-differentiating this production, that actually as one who works within this code and short-circuits it, so that the artist is a hacker and art is actually a virus within the internet.
Yes. Yes and no. Yes and no, because if the artist or somebody else, yeah, politician, whatever, writer, gets involved into the cyber wars, then he or she has these two goals at the same time. It's to break the codes of the other and to make one's own code unbreakable. It's two sides of the same war. Every war is attack and defense. There is no war that wouldn't be both. Yeah? So if you are engaged in this kind of confrontation, you have to do both things. And that is what Julian Assange is speaking about. Yeah? Breaking the codes or destroying the codes of the others, but make yourself anonymous. It is not accidentally that this very famous groups calls themselves anonymous. What does it mean, anonymous? It means precisely the impossibility to fix them, to find them, yeah? To break this encryption code. So there's both sides on it. There's not only this and not only that. And that is what I tried to say. And maybe another sentence to that. You know, many years ago I saw two movies. At the moment, I really forgot the names of everybody involved. One was Leaving New York and the other was Leaving Los Angeles. It was kind of very action-loaded American movies, and at the end of one of them, the guy got a kind of device that has an ability to cut the flow of electricity everywhere on Earth. And he does it. Okay? So at the moment I have this device to cut the electricity, it is enough for me. I can disregard any kind of protocols. Yeah? It's over. So there is always, first of all, the possibility to go further and further. And on the other hand, how far you can go is also dictated by how you manage to correlate your attack and defense strategy.
Does it work? Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question concerning what you call the inscription in the internet. Because regarding the fact that we have IP addresses, which are like a standard system that you can follow to find out where the anonymous guy is hidden, I would refer to what Foucault called the archive and the palimpsest, because in my opinion, the internet rather is like a palimpsest that you can constantly rewrite, and the archive is more a constant thing that would stay at the location.
No, the only thing I want to say is that the internet is traceable because it is found. And palimpsest, as is described, archive as is described by Foucault and Jeanette, palimpsest are both thought as being infinite. They both thought as being infinite in terms of you go further and further and further, and there's always another layer yeah, in front of you. It is a very typical, postmodern, I would say, failure, yeah, of thinking. Because there is no infinite processes. There is no infinite palimpsest. Because everything that is material, everything that is there, is always finite. Yeah, we are finite. We have finite existence, and so things around that have finite existence, and the internet is finite, and palimpsest is finite, and archive is finite, everything is finite. And that means you have a Google program, and you can always come to the end. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much, Boris.
Good.
As said, Boris will lead us through next couple of days, so today and tomorrow. So we will have opportunity to discuss further.
And now I do my duty, I believe, by announcing Kita Steil indeed as next speaker. I think here in Berlin, everyone knows her. She just published a wonderful new book, the E-Flux, Sternberg Press. And I must say, recently, a couple of months ago, I saw a wonderful exhibition by her in New York, really fascinating. So I'm very interested in what she will show, and I hope that you will be interested too. Thank you.